to this meeting of the Wooddale Community Development Commission. My name is Brad Karish. I'm the chairman of the Wooddale Community Development Commission. Will the secretary please call the roll?
Mr. Damasco.
Here.
Mr. Carriage.
Here.
Mr. Peterson is not here. Mr. Shemanek.
Here.
Mr. St. Marie. Didn't I see? No, I didn't see him. Mr. Vant.
Here.
And Mr. Woods.
Here. I declare a quorum present. Under business items, I'll entertain a motion to approve the meeting minutes from October 15th, 2018.
Second.
There being a motion and a second, all in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. Motion carries. The minutes are approved. We have one public hearing scheduled for tonight. All testimony will be given under oath. At the hearing, there'll be opportunity for the public to offer testimony and to comment. Please, I apologize for my nasalness and stuff. I'm battling this cold. So, following the public hearing, our deliberations will be open to the public in the sense that all are invited to listen and to watch. The public, however, may not speak during our deliberations. State statute requires a vote by the majority of the members of the Community Development Commission for those matters that will be referred to the City Council for approval and for those matters on which the Community Development Commission will make a final decision. Staff will provide a general description of the proposal followed by their analysis. With respect to others who wish to speak, you may give an opinion or present specific evidence as to why you believe that the applicant meets or fails to meet the standards of the request. Finally, we will strictly adhere to the schedule prepared for tonight's meeting. In the event that you or an attorney have filed an appearance as an objector, you will be offered sufficient time in which to present your evidence. Whether you're a member of the public wishing to make a statement for the record or a witness testifying on behalf of the case or an objector, you will be placed under oath and then begin by stating your name and address. If you are not presenting evidence on behalf of the case or an objector, your remarks will be taken after all those who have filed an appearance as an objector have presented all their evidence. You will be subject to question by the Community Development Commission. To allow as many people as possible to be heard, if you're not an objector, we would request that your remarks be limited to 5 minutes. If additional time is needed, the hearing will be continued until the next available meeting. I will now call the matter before us this evening. I'd also like to have Madam Secretary log in. Do we have one more in attendance?
Mr. St. Marie, yes, I've noted it.
Case number 2018-CDC-07 is in regard to a text amendment to Unified Development Ordinance, Chapter 17 of the Municipal Code. The proposed text amendments are intended to clarify the regulations by amending and adding definitions in Section 103, amending and consolidating use classification and the permitted use table in Section 17-503, and amending regulation related to off-street parking, including street transition and accessible parking in Section 17.607. Staff, please provide a summary of the request and indicate when notice of the hearing was published and to whether you have the certificate of publication from the newspaper.
Would you raise your right hand, state your name and address, please?
Sure, my name is Gosha Pucheha. The address is 404 North Wooddale Road in Wooddale, Illinois.
And do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. Thank you. The certificate of publication is on file. The notice was published in the Daily Herald on October 31st. In front today, we have, as you outlined, a proposal for a text amendment. There's actually 3 sections of the UDO that contain some sort of a modified section in them. Following presentation is just a summary of some of the items that we wanted to highlight. If there are any specific questions, we can always address them a little bit later. So to begin, the first section where we are proposing text amendments is the definitions, section 17.103C. There's actually a number of various definitions that were added, revised, or combined. The main intent was to, first of all, add definitions for uses which were not previously defined. We also wanted to provide consistent definitions throughout the UDO, so we looked at a number of different sections to make sure that the language, the wording was the same. And as we will discuss shortly in the following slides, a number of uses in the permitted uses table were combined together to eliminate some of the redundancies. Therefore, some of the definitions followed in suit. So some of the existing definitions were combined together. In other places, we added new definitions to kind of fill in some of the blanks in there. We did have a couple of definitions that were deleted, but that's mainly because they were being combined or absorbed by some of the other uses in there. Just to highlight some of the changes to our definitions section, I just wanted to highlight a couple of them. You could always reference the attachment A that was added to the memo. One of the items, one of the definitions added was, for example, for occupancy, which is the actual use of land, building, or structure. But we also added specific definitions to differentiate between residential and non-residential occupancy. Another item, for example, was the office. We already had a definition for the office, but we added and modified it slightly and also added different or at least we wanted to differentiate between more of an administrative professional office versus medical offices. So these are not new uses, it's just an updated or refreshed definition to really explain what the use entails. Personal grooming is another example. In this case, we actually combined existing uses, and in this case it was a barber shop and hair salon or beauty salon, which were separate, so they were added together because they were already permitted in the same or similar uses. I guess the main intent was to really provide clear definitions so that in the long run it would be easier both for staff and for members of the public to ensure that it's easier to identify which uses are permitted within separate districts. I did want to add, just to highlight few of the main sections, we did add a number of definitions in the motor vehicle uses and also transportation uses that you can see in the attachments. And also the last item is a number of uses in the Thorndale overlay districts were not defined, so we wanted to address those as well with this proposed text amendment. The next section, so the second section that I referenced earlier, where we see proposed text amendments, is the actual table of permitted uses. This is in reference to attachment Exhibit B and Exhibit C with the memo. And as I mentioned earlier, we combined various uses into more defined use groups. So we really wanted to eliminate some of the redundancies that were already there. And we didn't really look at the entire table, only some of the use groups or subcategories that are listed. So that included manufacturing, motor vehicle, personal and business services, residential uses, transportation and utility, and wholesale. So over the next few slides, I just want to highlight only a few of the what we considered major changes. And as I said, we could always address any specific questions as we come across them. So the first one for residential uses, this actually wasn't a change, but we wanted to clarify dwelling units that would be permitted only above the ground floor. What you'll see at the bottom of the slides is actually what the proposed language is and what the existing language was. So dwelling units were permitted in the C1 and CBT business district, but only on the upper floors. So we just wanted to ensure that the definition really states how we've been administering the code in the past. So there's really no change in here, but it's just more an update to the terminology. Another category of uses, and here I have a couple that I wanted to touch upon, would be the motor vehicle repair facility. This was already defined in our municipal code, and we found that there's at least 4 that we can see here. Motor vehicle, the body shop, and there's a repair facility, there's a service garage for livery and taxi cab. A lot of these were essentially very similar. So they were combined into motor vehicle repair facility, but for passenger vehicles based on the size. But we also have a separate category for repair facility for commercial or larger vehicles. We also added definitions to really clarify what a passenger motor vehicle is, what a commercial motor vehicle is, and even just the motor vehicle itself. So we wanted to make sure that looking at a definition, if there's questions, there's always references in our definitions that will make it clear which use would be the most applicable to a proposed situation. Moving on to transportation and utilities, there's a couple actually items I wanted to highlight in here. The first one, dispatch. Mainly it's an organization or scheduling of transportation, so typically an office operation. We did see a number of existing uses, so listed on the slide here: ambulance, bus, livery, and taxi cab. So a lot of these are more of a dispatch on office operations, so they were combined into dispatch services for the passenger. And we also did have cartage services and freight forwarding without terminal. Those uses were not necessarily defined in our code, but the best fit was to kind of stay consistent with the dispatch services, because essentially it really deals with scheduling of the transportation of, in this case, freight. So that's how the two categories came together. And I did want to clarify that, as I mentioned, this is just for the office operation per se, so those uses actually exclude on-site parking, which for parking and storage we will address a little bit later. Another item under transportation and utilities was freight handling. We did have a definition for freight forwarding service with a terminal. And it was something that was permitted in our light industrial, which is I-1, and in the I-2 zoning district. We actually kept the existing definition for the freight forwarding service with terminal, but we slightly modified it. So it actually reads right now that freight handling facility is a building or portion thereof in which freight is assembled or temporarily stored for routing or reshipment, and it may include dispatch services. So I think the key here is that there's more frequent traffic and short-term storage. So that's a couple of key items that really differentiate this use from, let's say, a warehouse operation that we have defined in a different section. What we also had in our code was, as you can see on the other side, is wholesaling, warehousing, local cartage extras facilities. So it was a number of uses that were combined together, and those uses were actually permitted in the I-1, which is the light industrial, in the I-2 zoning district. So what we proposed to do, because one of them was listed as a special use in the light industrial, and the other one was listed as a permitted use. And I do apologize, I hope this is easy to read. We put together a map of all of the parcels that are in the I-1, which is light industrial zoning district. What you will see in dark pink color, those would be parcels that are 2 acres or smaller. And then anything that's in blue is actually 2 acres or larger. And what we're proposing is to actually limit the freight handling facilities that are on smaller parcels, so the ones that are under 2 acres, to be a special use. And the main reason is that because the lots are smaller, in order for them to really accommodate the traffic that is typical for a freight handling facility, we want to make sure that there's some additional oversight and review, and a public hearing would be required for a special use in this case, just to make sure that that is actually the intended use or the specific good use for that particular parcel. However, on lots that are 2 acres or larger, we're proposing that these remain a permitted use, mainly because in a lot of instances, the lots and the buildings on site are already larger. The 2 acres that is being used, it actually relates to building typology, building type 13 versus 14. Any building that's actually on lot that's larger than 2 acres would be the type 14, and typically that encompasses much larger industrial buildings, and the sites are much larger. And those are typically well-equipped, and as we can see, a lot of the existing buildings that are present in the light industrial district are already equipped to handle such traffic and such use of the property. So that's why there's a determination based on size. What we also added on is freight yard, which I will define in the next slide. But freight yard typically refers to a parking and storage, and it's an outdoor parking and storage of trailers or shipping containers of trucks. And we wanted to clarify that on those smaller lots that are under 2 acres, that freight yards would not be permitted. However, if it's a larger yard, if it's a larger parcel, then a freight yard may or may not be permitted depending on what the actual operation is of that particular business. And as I said, so this is our freight yard. We actually combined 3 different existing uses, which would be the shipping storage container, a truck freight terminal, and truck trailer storage. So these, as I said, mainly parking and storage, and they are actually listed as special uses in our light industrial and in the I-2 zoning district. And moving on to the third section where we see amendments presented today. This is section 17.607, which is off-street parking and loading requirements. 2 items that are listed here. The first one is the transition space that's required between right-of-way and a parking. And in this, the actual specific language states that it's a transition space between the nearest parking space, an intersecting driveway, or parking aisle. The current regulations require a 30-foot transition space between the street and where the parking lot essentially begins. And that is mainly to ensure that there's traffic safety and circulation, so that there aren't any negative implications on the traffic that's on the street and in the actual parking lot itself. However, what we've seen is that the same requirement would typically be applied if there's an alley in the back. And because the traffic that's existing on alleys is not as it's not as busy, and definitely it cannot be compared to a typical traffic on the street, we're proposing that the transition space between the alley and the parking lot be reduced to 10 feet. That typically allows a lot more flexibility in terms of the parking lot design, but there's still that 10-foot separation required just to make sure that there's a little bit of space in between, and that's for design purposes of the parking lot and also for visual. And the second item in this section that we are proposing to modify is just a reference to the Americans with Disabilities Act. We do have a section that talks about handicap parking, and Illinois actually recently updated the Illinois Accessibility Code, and it already references the ADA requirements. Therefore, we're just proposing to remove them from our section because we are referencing the Illinois Accessibility Code already in there, so one sort of implicates the indicates that the other one would be required as well. So to summarize, staff is proposing, or actually recommending that the text amendments be approved. The main they are consistent with the comprehensive plan and the UDO. The main intent, as I stated before, is that we're trying to clarify some of the redundancies, clarify the definitions to make it a little bit easier in terms of interpreting for both staff and public, but also to make it easier to enforce. And I'll be happy to answer any other questions.
Does anyone have any questions? Please.
I want to go back to this freight services. 2 acres or more?
George, just make sure you're getting in the line there, because we're on.
Okay. Under this freight terminals of 2 acres or more, they could more or less do what they want, but under 2 acres, we're gonna regulate?
So if it's in the I-1, which is the light industrial district,
Yes.
anything that's smaller than 2 acres, it's still permitted, but it's a special use. So they would actually have to appear before the CDC as a public hearing, and then they could go to the city council for final approval.
So they have to come here to get more business?
Yes, and that's actually, that's how it currently is in our code. So what we're trying to do is provide some flexibility for the larger parcels by allowing them as a special use for anything that's larger than 2 acres. So we're not necessarily trying to propose a change in the use, but we're adding some of the definitions, we're combining some of them, and this is our interpretation of what's the best approach.
Thank you.
So if they're under the 2 acres, they're gonna have to come for a special use. Do we have anybody that's already under 2 acres that didn't need special use already? Are they gonna be grandfathered in?
Go ahead, Chris.
So I believe there may be some properties that would fall into this, and if the regulation changes after they've already been legally established, then they would be considered a non-conforming use. So if they were to change or expand their operation in some way, it could trigger the requirement for a special use approval. But if it was already established prior to this, then they would not have to come in now to get this approval. But it would apply for new businesses, for example, that would want to occupy properties that are less than 2 acres in size, looking to do this particular use.
Is the city going to notify these or these businesses of this change?
Well, the publication was published, and we don't necessarily have a listing of specific businesses that would be affected, not to our knowledge, because they're already established, as Kelly explained. They would be considered, in some of them could be considered non-conforming, but they would be permitted to remain in space, in the whatever space they're occupying.
Anything else?
Thank you.
So if I had one of those buildings and I sold it, at that point in time, that would have to be disclosed, and it would have to be known by the owner that's purchasing it. And even if it's for the same use, they'd have to go for a special use, correct?
Well,
Not necessarily. So if it's a non-conforming use can continue regardless of the actual owner of the property. It has to do with the actual occupants of that space. So if it's going from the same use, only a different business, we would have to make the determination that it is a continuation of the non-conforming use. But generally speaking, that would be allowed to continue. Now, if there is, for example, according to our non-conforming use provisions, if it's abandoned for a period of 12 months or more, then any subsequent user that wants to reestablish that use would have to come in and then seek special use approval to do so.
and if I may, I did want to clarify, currently, the way our table of permitted uses is written, freight forwarding services with terminal is a special use. So we're not really changing that. The special use, if we don't even continue with the text amendment, it was a special use. It's been a special use.
Coach,
So-
I just want to piggyback on that, because I think maybe there's some misunderstanding. It sounds like, as the code currently exists, it is already a special use. And I think what staff is proposing is to relax that requirement as to the larger parcel, to make it a permitted use for the larger parcel. So currently, right now, a business owner would have to come in for a special use.
Whether they're large or small.
Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Is there anyone in objection to the petition, or any member of the general public in attendance who wishes to make a comment or has question regarding this request? If so, please stand to be placed under oath. No? Okay. Let's see, we can just skip right on down. If there's no other, having no other additional testimony, I will now close the public hearing for case number 2018-CDC-07. We'll now proceed into deliberation of the merits of this request. Is there any other further discussion that the board would like to have on this?
And just as a reminder, I know I sound like a broken record, this is the portion where the deliberations are between the members. At this point, the public hearing piece is closed, so this is just for the members to deliberate amongst each other.
So do you have a better understanding of what they're trying to do here? It was something that was in place already, and just now that the larger parcels, they won't have to come for special use, the smaller parcels will still have to get special use, which they were required to do before, so.
Understood.
Okay, just wanted to make sure we're all good. Anyone else? Anything? Okay. There being no further discussion, I'm looking for a motion. Suggested motion is provided in the staff memo.
Yeah, if you turn to page 3 of the staff memo, the very last paragraph is a suggested motion, and any member can make that motion. Again, remember, just because you make the motion doesn't mean you have to vote for it, it's just getting it onto the floor for a vote.
Yep.
I'd like to make a motion.
And you can, George. You just would read that language in the last paragraph.
Okay, based on the various proposed tax amendments of the UDO as summarized in the staff memo, I move that the Committee Development Commission adopt the findings of fact, including within the staff memo as the findings of the Community Development Commission, and recommend to the City Council approve of case number 2018-CDC-07.
So moved.
There being a motion to recommend, there being a motion to recommend approval and a second made, will the secretary please call the roll? As a reminder, a yes vote will be to recommend approval and a no vote will be to recommend denial.
Can I ask for clarification?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Who was the motioner and
So,
who was the seconder? We had three.
Seconder.
We had three.
Yeah.
Oh,
George read the motion, which George can do. So George was the maker of the motion.
Okay, that's what I have.
Second by Mr. St. Marie.
Second, okay. Thank you.
Okay, and a roll call. Mr. Damasco. Mr. Carriage, this is a yes or no?
Yes or no vote?
A yes or no? Okay, thank you. Mr. Carriage,
Yes.
Mr. Shemanek, Mr. St. Marie,
yes.
Mr. Vant,
Yes.
and Mr. Woods.
Yes.
The motion to recommend approval of the proposed text amendment to Chapter 17 carries. Moving on to staff liaison report. Is there any report from staff?
I just want to take this opportunity to reintroduce Scotia, who is the new planner here, and we're very excited to have her here with us. And I hope that all of you have had a chance to meet her. But I do want to make the commission aware also that we have some upcoming developments that will be occurring. I believe that we've got some pretty large developments that are being proposed. I believe February, we might have one in January, one in February, and possibly one in March. So just want to hope that you will keep your schedules open. These will be very exciting coming forward soon.
Nothing for December?
As of right now, we have received no applications, so it is my expectation that we will be canceling the December meeting here probably, actually within a couple days, because we would have to publish for it, and we'll run out of time.
Okay.
So I believe that either, if we haven't done it by the, before Thanksgiving, then it's likely we'll do it probably first thing next week, if we don't have anything.
All right. Well, there being no other reports, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
No one wants to leave.
Second?
Second.
Okay,
Okay. There being a motion and a second, all in favor by saying aye. Okay, although opposed, say nay. Motion carries, the meeting is adjourned.